A lot of people accuse the Chinese of trying to take over the world. I don't buy that for 1 minute. At the moment, they're just sitting back watching the Western world destroy itself, actually, with this, unnecessary war. Trump's tearing up alliances. The Europeans paralysed by, inability to work together.
In the past, NATO summits like the one held at Ankara this week were gatherings of the world's most powerful nations, a symbol of Western dominance. But as those allies increasingly disagree over issues like Ukraine, Iran and Greenland, other powers are gaining influence. In his new book, Eclipsing the West, the former Liberal Democrat leader and business secretary Sir Vince Cable argues that China and India are on track to become the most powerful countries in the world. And I'm pleased to say that Sir Vince Cable joins me now in the studio. Welcome to the show, Sir Vince.
Thank you for inviting me on.
It's very good to have you on. So tell us about your thesis that China and India are going to become the most powerful countries in the world.
Well, the argument is that while we have a lot of noise, and, Trump particularly being a dominant figure on the world stage, wars and issues of that kind, there is something quietly happening under the surface. Since in the last 30 years, the share of the Western world in the world economy, the Western world being Europe, North America, Japan, essentially, has shrunk from 60% to 40%. And the big emerging markets have gone the other direction, 40 to 60%. They now have the majority of the world economy, and this was led by China. China's now got some problems, but India is now the most rapidly growing major economy in the world by a long way. And you've got Vietnam, other countries in that region, even some of the more dynamic places in Africa beginning to motor. So the centre of the world economy has moved. And, when the economy moves, a lot of things that you can deal with economies, like spending more on defence or prestige issues of various kind.
And of course, this leads to a whole host of questions that we can explore here. The first, I guess, is it a case, is it a case of either or can one argue, as the pie gets bigger, the world economy grows, everybody gets wealthier. China becoming richer does not necessarily mean the West must become poorer.
No, I think that's a very powerful and important point. And we are interdependent, and we should try to keep that. There are so many pressures at the moment to cut your links with one country or the other. Particularly the Trump view of the world, it's zero sum. If we gain, somebody else loses, vice versa. I think we should accept the fact that the reason why the world is in a much better place than it was at the end of the Second World War is that living standards have risen almost everywhere. And in poor countries, hundreds of millions of people have lifted out of poverty. It's the fact that we're interdependent and we traded a lot. And when you trade a lot, you become more vulnerable, actually. But that's part of having a world where people depend on each other, and we shouldn't walk away from international trade and the other aspects of globalization, as it's called.
You were the business secretary. In fact, I was one of your junior ministers, and you're an old China hand as well. You've spent time working in China, and we have this interesting situation now in the UK, partly driven by Washington, where almost any Chinese company is regarded with deep suspicion. You read stories about don't drive a Chinese car onto a military base, for example. But is there within your analysis a call for Britain to recalibrate and to understand perhaps that we should have good relations with China? They're going to be a significant trading partner.
Yeah, we should. We shouldn't be naive about it. There are a lot of bad things happening in China, and we're not dealing with Mother Teresa here. Very hard-headed and ruthless, and there are issues in which I'm sure they want to do us down. But you have to deal with them, and there are potentially mutual interests. I think we've made some bad mistakes. For example, recently, one of our best energy companies, Octopus Energy, had a collaborative project with the biggest wind turbine manufacturer in China to set up a big factory in Scotland, create thousands of jobs, bring the best wind farm technology to Britain. And it was vetoed by the British government on what they call national security ground. It was never explained what that meant, and I've probed into a little bit, and it's a bit insubstantial. There is an element of paranoia. We shouldn't be naive in dealing with China, but paranoia is the other extreme, and I think we've lurched a bit in that direction, partly under pressure from the US.
And what does the rise of India and China mean in terms of geopolitics? Because although we regard China with suspicion, it's not necessarily a country that's a sort of interventionist country. It has its issue with Taiwan, but India as well, outside of its own near region, does not seem a country that's going to get overly involved in international foreign affairs, or have I got that wrong?
You're quite right. They're not active outside the Indian subcontinent, and they're not yet, a great power. Arguably, on some measures, probably the third biggest economy in the world. But from India's point of view, their main preoccupation is holding the country together, lifting many, many more people out of poverty. There's still vast poverty in India, despite some very dynamic areas, and that's their preoccupation, and rightly so. The Chinese, there's a lot of people accuse the Chinese of trying to take over the world. I don't buy that for 1 minute. At the moment, they're just sitting back watching the Western world destroy itself, actually, with this, unnecessary war. Trump's tearing up alliances. The Europeans paralysed by, inability to work together. So there's not a great deal of active Chinese activity outside of business, but they're doing good business, and their exports are growing rapidly, and they have a near monopoly of some key technologies now, particularly in the green technologies. But they're roughly a little bit behind the US in artificial intelligence and advanced chips, things like quantum physics. They're probably now on a par, and the Chinese are just quietly building up their technological strength in the belief that in the long run this is what will take them to be number one.
And I mean, in terms of the changing the mindset of the British and how British business does international business, I'm very conscious that it feels that although we have a deep and long-standing history with India, we're very underpowered in how we engage with India. When I was the minister responsible for the film industry, I talked to Hollywood all the time, but I never talked to Bollywood. And I remember having a conversation with the outgoing High Commissioner from India, who's just left, funnily enough, to go to China.
About Doraiswamy.
Yeah.
Very impressive guy.
Very impressive. Why don't we do more defence contracts? Build planes with the Indians. We always think our natural partners are either the Americans or our European partners. So, do you feel that we're completely underpowered in terms of how we engage with Indian business?
Well, it's not just India. Britain has become, sadly, very inward-looking. The fact that we change our prime ministers in the way we change football managers doesn't help our credibility, and it means there isn't any real long-term thinking going on in Whitehall. But no, to the credit of the government and the last government, we have cobbled together an agreement with India, which is quite far-reaching and opens markets. Something your government did, which is to sign us up to an Asia-Pacific agreement, the CGTPP. I think I've got the acronym right.
The CPTPP.
Well done, thank you. It doesn't do much in the short run, but it does take Britain to the Asia-Pacific, where much of the growth is. So it's not an entirely bad story, but I think in general, particularly since Brexit, Britain has shriveled somewhat.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not going to disagree with you on that, although I'll get a lot of angry texts from Times Radio listeners about that. I mean, I said earlier that India and China don't strike me as kind of countries that are interventionists, but obviously as their wealth grows and their power grows, they will inevitably want to play their role on the national stage. I can see China is a sort of a clearer map, and there will be friction, particularly with countries like Japan and Australia, our natural allies. It's hard to see what role India would want to play. I mean, there are things like, should India go on the UN Security Council and that kind of thing? Is India ready to play a more dominant role?
Absolutely. And I think if we were far-sighted, we would acknowledge that this is something that's coming. I mean, we're going to have to face the fact that, Britain and France, some middle powers these days, have vetoes in the Security Council, but very important countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia don't. And if we're going to get these international bodies to be serious players, they've got to be more representative. And my impression is that, the Indians in particular do recognize that they have a role to play in all of this. I think what is beginning to emerge, it's not quite like NATO, but you're beginning to get pacts being formed in the Asia-Pacific area, Japan, India, Australia, supported by the US. And that may be something very much of the future.
And it's interesting as well that India is sort of sticks resolutely to the sort of non-aligned route. I mean, we in the West get outraged that India has not taken a firmer stance on Ukraine, but we forget that India has long-standing ties with Russia. I say that in a neutral way. So should we perhaps be more understanding that if you're sitting in Delhi or indeed in Beijing, you do have a different perspective?
Yes, well, I think particularly with the Trump administration going rogue, I think most countries, including ours, I think have got to accept the fact that we've got to develop relationships with a lot of countries and governments we don't like. And the Indians, for historic reasons, as you said, have long had... Well, they used to have links with the Soviet Union, now with Russia, and they try to balance that with their relations with us, with China, with the US. And people find that irritating, but it is the world. And we've got to get into the habit of doing the same thing. We need better relations with the European Union. We also need to continue to work with the US for economic reasons as much as defense reasons, and to have working relationships with the Chinese, the Indians, a lot of others. It's getting into a very messy, some people call it multipolar world. It's not one we're used to. Where we were cuddled up in the European Union and we relied entirely on the US for defence. And that world is gone, and we've got to rethink it.
Absolutely. Sir Vince Cable, thank you for coming on. I know that you were at the Bradford Literature Festival this Saturday talking about your book, Eclipsing the West, which comes out on the 1st of September. By the way, there are also lots of great events taking place at the Bradford Literature Festival this weekend, and tickets are still available. This is Ed Vaizey on Times Radio.